The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruins of what had once been Millbrook Valley's bustling main street. Smoke still curled from the charred remains of the general store, and shattered glass caught the light like scattered diamonds on the dusty ground. Among the debris, a lone figure moved with quiet determination. Emma Walsh knelt beside the remnants of her schoolhouse, her hands trembling as she pulled her leather-bound teaching journal from beneath a fallen beam. The pages were singed but readable, and for the first time since the horror began, she allowed herself a small smile. This journal would become the foundation for something extraordinary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Walsh had always believed that knowledge was the most powerful tool a person could possess. As the only schoolteacher in Millbrook Valley, she had spent 3 years nurturing young minds and watching the small Colorado Territory town grow from a rough mining camp into a proper community. The town nestled between rolling foothills and dense pine forests, with Swift Creek providing fresh water and the promise of prosperity. 200 souls called Millbrook Valley home, from the weathered miners who worked the surrounding claims to the families who had traveled west seeking new beginnings. The summer of 1872 had been particularly promising. The railroad surveyors had visited twice, hinting at the possibility of a depot that would connect their remote settlement to the wider world. Children filled Emma's classroom each morning, eager to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. The adults gathered in the evenings to discuss plans for a proper town hall and maybe even a newspaper. Emma felt a deep satisfaction watching her students grow and the community flourish around her. She had been preparing lessons for the upcoming school year when the thunder of hoofbeats shattered the peaceful afternoon. From her classroom window, Emma watched in horror as masked riders swept down the main street like a plague of locusts. The Iron Hand Gang, led by the notorious Jack Murphy, had chosen Millbrook Valley as their latest target. Their black bandanas bore the distinctive iron fist symbol that struck terror throughout the territory. The attack came without warning and showed no mercy. Murphy's men systematically looted every building, taking not just valuables, but destroying what they couldn't carry. The general store was ransacked, its shelves emptied and windows smashed. The church bells rang frantically until gunshots silenced them forever. Families fled in panic, some escaping into the surrounding forest, while others weren't so fortunate. Emma had hidden in the schoolhouse cellar, pressing her hands over her ears to block out the sounds of destruction above. Through the small window, she watched neighbors she had known for years, running for their lives. Old Henrik, who ran the blacksmith shop, fell trying to protect his life's work. Mrs. Patterson, whose daughter was Emma's brightest student, disappeared into the chaos and was never seen again. The horror seemed to last forever, though it was probably no more than 2 hours before the gang rode away, leaving devastation in their wake. When silence finally returned, Emma emerged to find her world transformed into a nightmare. The bustling community she had called home was now a graveyard of broken dreams and scattered belongings. Bodies lay in the street, and the few survivors who remained were too traumatized to do more than weep over their losses. By evening, most of the remaining townspeople had packed what they could salvage and left for Denver or Colorado Springs, unwilling to rebuild in a place that held such terrible memories. Emma stood alone in the ruins as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the devastation in shades of red and gold. She was the last woman standing in what had once been a thriving community. Her teaching salary was gone, her students were scattered to the winds, and her comfortable little life had been reduced to ashes and memories. The sensible thing would be to follow the others, to accept defeat, and start over somewhere safe. But Emma Walsh had never been one to take the easy path. As she walked through the destroyed streets, something stirred within her that surprised even herself. This wasn't just about personal loss or survival. This was about justice, about refusing to let evil triumph, about proving that communities could be reborn from the darkest moments. The town charter and land deeds were still locked in the bank's safe, which the outlaws had been unable to crack. The legal foundation of Millbrook Valley remained intact, even if everything else lay in ruins. That first night, Emma made her bed in the church, one of the few buildings still partially standing. She had salvaged some blankets and a bit of food, enough to last a few days while she planned her next move. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the sounds of the wind whistling through broken windows and the distant howl of coyotes drawn by the scent of death. But even in her exhaustion, Emma's mind was already working, already beginning to envision what Millbrook Valley could become again. The next morning brought an unexpected encounter that would change everything. Emma was gathering supplies from the ruins of the general store when she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around, heart racing, to find a tall man with weathered features and keen gray eyes watching her from the doorway. He wore the practical clothes of a frontiersman, and something in his bearing suggested military training. "Didn't expect to find anyone still here," the stranger said, his voice careful and respectful. "I'm Marcus Cole. I was tracking the gang that did this when I saw the smoke." Emma studied him warily. In the aftermath of such violence, trust didn't come easily. "I'm Emma Walsh. I was the school teacher here." She paused, then corrected herself. "I am the school teacher here." Marcus noticed the distinction and nodded approvingly. "You planning to stay then? Rebuild?" "Someone has to," Emma replied simply. "This was a good town, it can be again." Marcus had been a cavalry scout before the war ended and had spent the years since tracking outlaws and helping settlements defend themselves. He had seen too many communities destroyed and abandoned, their potential lost forever. Something about Emma's quiet determination resonated with him. Here was someone who understood that running away only gave evil more power. "The Iron Hand gang won't stay gone forever," Marcus warned. "Murphy likes to hit the same places twice, especially if he thinks there's still something worth taking." Emma's jaw tightened. "Then we'll be ready for them." The pronoun wasn't lost on Marcus. She had said "we," even though they had just met. It spoke to a kind of optimism and leadership that impressed him. Most people in her situation would be focused solely on personal survival. But Emma was already thinking about community, about building something larger than herself. Over the following days, Marcus found himself staying to help with the immediate necessities of survival. Together, they salvaged what they could from the ruins, including tools, building materials, and preserved food that the gang had overlooked. Emma showed him the hidden root cellar behind the church, where the town's emergency supplies had been stored, provisions that would keep them fed through the coming weeks. Emma's knowledge of the town proved invaluable. She knew which buildings had the strongest foundations, where the best timber could be found, and how the water systems worked. Marcus contributed his practical skills in construction, hunting, and security. They made an unlikely but effective team, combining Emma's vision and organizational abilities with Marcus's technical expertise and frontier experience. As they worked side by side, they began to share their stories. Emma spoke of her students and her dreams for what education could accomplish in the frontier territories. She had come west not for gold or land, but because she believed that knowledge and learning were the keys to building a better society. Marcus told her about his years as a scout, the places he had seen destroyed by violence, and his growing conviction that someone needed to stand up to the chaos that seemed to follow civilization westward. Their partnership deepened through shared purpose and mutual respect. Emma discovered that Marcus had a keen mind for strategy and planning. While he learned to appreciate her ability to see the bigger picture, and inspire others to work toward common goals. Neither of them spoke of romance, but something was growing between them that was deeper than mere attraction. They were building not just a town, but a life together. The first real test of their alliance came when supplies began running low. The nearest town was 3 days away by horseback, and making the journey would leave whoever remained behind vulnerable to attack. They had to choose between risking exposure or facing starvation, and the decision revealed how much they had. "Come to trust each other." "I'll go," Marcus offered. "You know this place better than I do. If anyone can keep things together here, it's you." Emma shook her head. "We both go, or neither of us goes. We're stronger together." They decided to make the journey together, caching their most precious possessions and leaving signs that would make it appear the town was still abandoned. The trip to Georgetown was successful, yielding not only supplies but also their first recruits for the rebuilding effort. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Word had spread about the woman who refused to abandon her town, and several families who had lost everything to the same gang were inspired by Emma's example. Among the new arrivals was Rose Mackenzie, an elderly widow whose ranch had been burned. Out the previous spring, she brought with her decades of frontier experience and a network of contacts throughout the territory. Rose had known hardship and loss, but she also understood the power of perseverance and community building. She became Emma's mentor and advisor, helping to navigate the complex challenges of rebuilding not just buildings, but social structures and economic foundations. The rebuilding process was slow and demanding. Each day brought new challenges, from structural problems with damaged buildings to disputes over resources and priorities. Emma found herself taking on roles she had never expected, serving as mayor, judge, architect, and spiritual leader all at once. Her background as a teacher proved surprisingly relevant, as rebuilding a town required many of the same skills as educating children: patience, clear communication, the ability to inspire others to work toward long-term goals, and the wisdom to know when to be firm and when to show compassion. Marcus proved equally adaptable, taking on responsibilities for security, construction oversight, and liaison work with nearby settlements. His military background and practical skills made him a natural leader among the men, while his partnership with Emma demonstrated a new model of shared leadership that impressed both newcomers and occasional visitors. As autumn arrived and the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks, Millbrook Valley was beginning to look like a town again. The main street had been cleared and partially rebuilt. The church roof had been repaired, and services resumed, with Emma often delivering impromptu sermons about resilience and community. A new general store opened in a hastily constructed building, and the school was preparing to welcome its first students since the raid. But Emma knew their greatest test was yet to come. Reports reached them that the Iron Hand Gang was active again, hitting settlements to the south and working their way north. Jack Murphy had a reputation for returning to places he had robbed before, especially if he heard they were recovering. The approaching winter would limit travel and communication, leaving Millbrook Valley isolated and vulnerable. Emma and Marcus began preparing defenses, but they knew they couldn't fight Murphy's gang alone. They needed allies, and Emma's reputation as the woman who wouldn't surrender was beginning to attract attention from unexpected quarters. A group of Civil War veterans looking for purpose in peacetime offered their services. Several Native American guides, impressed by the respectful treatment they had received in the rebuilt town, provided intelligence about gang movements in the region. The community that emerged from these preparations was unlike the original Millbrook Valley. It was more diverse, more democratic, and more resilient. Emma's leadership style encouraged participation and shared decision-making rather than top-down authority. The school became not just a place for children's education, but a community center where adults gathered to debate policy, share skills, and plan for the future. As winter deepened and the mountain passes became treacherous, the residents of Millbrook Valley settled in for what they knew would be a long, cold season. But they were no longer the scattered, traumatized survivors who had fled in terror months earlier. They were a community forged by adversity, led by a woman who had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to destruction is the quiet determination to build something better. The first blizzard of the season arrived earlier than anyone expected, transforming Millbrook Valley into a world of white silence. Emma stood at the window of the rebuilt church, watching snowflakes dance in the lamplight as wind howled through the mountain passes. The storm had been raging for 3 days, and she knew it was only the beginning of what would be a harsh winter. But inside the warm building, 23 families had gathered for their weekly community meeting, their voices mixing with the crackle of the wood stove as they discussed plans that would have seemed impossible just months before. Samuel Hayes had arrived the previous week, his wagon loaded with mining equipment salvaged from abandoned claims throughout the territory. He was Marcus's younger brother, though the family resemblance was more evident in their shared determination than in their physical appearance. Where Marcus was tall and lean, with graying temples, Samuel was stockier and dark-haired, his hands permanently stained from years of working with metals and machinery. He had spent the war years in the Pennsylvania coal mines, learning engineering, skills that proved invaluable in the reconstruction effort. The relationship between the brothers carried an undercurrent of tension that Emma had learned to navigate carefully. Samuel had always been the ambitious one, eager to prove himself, worthy of respect and recognition. He admired Marcus's military service and frontier expertise, but he also resented living in his older brother's shadow. Their reunion in Millbrook Valley was both joyful and complicated, filled with unspoken competition and old family dynamics. Emma recognized the pattern because she had seen it countless times in her classroom. Siblings often struggled to define themselves in relation to each other, especially when one had achieved recognition or authority. She made a point of consulting Samuel directly on technical matters, giving him opportunities to lead projects and demonstrate his expertise. Her diplomatic approach helped ease the brothers' relationship while also strengthening the community's infrastructure development. Samuel's mining background proved crucial as winter deepened and resources became scarce. He identified several played-out claims near the town that still contained enough ore to be profitable with proper equipment and organization. More importantly, he understood water management systems and helped design improvements to the town's wells and drainage that would prevent the flooding problems that had plagued the original settlement. The discovery of usable mining equipment in an abandoned claim up Devil's Canyon came at exactly the right time. A prospector named William Turner had died the previous spring, leaving behind a partially constructed stamp mill and several tons of machinery. Samuel organized a salvage expedition before the heavy snows made the canyon impassable, bringing back equipment that would allow Millbrook Valley to process ore locally rather than shipping raw materials to distant refineries. Emma watched Samuel work with growing admiration. His technical knowledge complemented Marcus's strategic thinking and her own organizational abilities. Together, the three of them formed a leadership team that could address challenges from multiple angles. Samuel's presence also relieved some of the pressure on Marcus, who had been trying to handle too many responsibilities single-handedly. The mining operation became more than just an economic opportunity. It provided work for the men during the winter months when outdoor construction was impossible, and it gave the community a shared project that built both skills and camaraderie. Samuel established a workshop in the old blacksmith building, teaching basic metalworking and machinery maintenance to anyone willing to learn. Emma often stopped by in the evenings, fascinated by the transformation of raw materials into useful tools and equipment. Rose Mackenzie proved to be an unexpected ally in managing the complex social dynamics of the growing community. Her years of frontier experience had taught her how to mediate disputes and build consensus among strong-willed individuals. She had a gift for knowing when to offer advice and when to step back, and her presence gave Emma a trusted confidant who understood the unique challenges of female leadership in a male-dominated environment. Rose had lost her husband and 2 sons to cholera during the journey west 15 years earlier. But instead of breaking her, the tragedy had forged her into someone who understood both the fragility and the resilience of human communities. She had built a successful ranch from nothing, defended it against Indian raids and outlaw attacks, and watched it burn to nothing in a single afternoon. Her decision to join Emma's rebuilding effort was based on hard-won wisdom about what made communities survive and thrive. Under Rose's guidance, Emma learned to balance her natural inclination toward democratic decision-making with the need for decisive leadership during crises. Rose taught her how to read the mood of a room, how to identify potential troublemakers before they became problems, and how to use ceremony and ritual to strengthen community bonds. Most importantly, Rose helped Emma understand that leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about creating space for others to contribute their best ideas and efforts. The weekly community meetings became a cornerstone of the rebuilt town's identity. Unlike the original Millbrook Valley, which had been governed by a handful of prominent men making decisions behind closed doors, the new version operated on principles of transparency and participation. Every family had a voice in major decisions, and disputes were resolved through open discussion rather than arbitrary authority. Emma's teaching background served her well in these meetings. She knew how to facilitate discussions, draw out quiet voices, and help people articulate their ideas clearly. She established ground rules that prevented arguments from becoming personal attacks, and she made sure that every proposal was thoroughly examined before votes were taken. The process was sometimes slow and occasionally frustrating, but it built genuine consensus and shared ownership of the community's direction. The approach paid dividends when difficult decisions had to be made. When food supplies ran lower than expected in January, the community voted to implement rationing rather than letting individual families hoard resources. When a dispute arose over water rights between the mining operation and the agricultural families, they developed a sharing agreement that satisfied both sides. When news arrived that the Iron Hand Gang was active again in the Southern Territories, they voted unanimously to prepare defenses rather than abandon the town. Marcus took charge of the defense preparations with characteristic thoroughness. His military experience taught him that successful defense required not just weapons and fortifications, but also intelligence, communication, and coordinated planning. He established a network of lookouts on the surrounding ridges, created signal systems for rapid communication, and organized training sessions where every adult learned basic combat skills. The defensive preparations revealed hidden strengths within the community. Several of the Civil War veterans who had joined the rebuilding effort proved to be natural leaders who could organize and train others effectively. Women who had never held weapons before showed remarkable aptitude for marksmanship when their family's safety was at stake. Even the older children contributed by serving as messengers and helping to maintain equipment. Emma initially struggled with the martial aspects of community defense. Her instincts as an educator inclined her toward peaceful resolution of conflicts, and the idea of preparing for violence made her uncomfortable. But Rose helped her understand that sometimes the willingness to fight was necessary to preserve the possibility of peace. The choice wasn't between violence and non-violence, but between being victims and being protectors of something worth defending. The transformation of Millbrook Valley's physical infrastructure proceeded alongside these social and defensive developments. Samuel's mining operations provided income that funded improvements to buildings, roads, and public facilities. The school expanded to include technical training alongside traditional academics, preparing young people for the modern economy that was emerging in the territory. The church served multiple functions as meeting hall, social center, and emergency shelter, reflecting the community's practical approach to institution building. Emma's role evolved from school teacher to something resembling a frontier mayor, though no official title captured the full scope of her responsibilities. She mediated disputes, coordinated with territorial authorities, managed the community's finances, and represented Millbrook Valley in negotiations with other settlements. Her reputation spread throughout the region as word of the town's remarkable recovery attracted visitors, potential settlers, and business opportunities. The arrival of railroad surveyors in February brought both excitement and anxiety. The proposed Denver and Rio Grande line would pass within 5 miles of Millbrook Valley, close enough to provide access to markets and supplies, but far enough away to preserve the community's character. Emma found herself negotiating with corporate representatives who had expected to deal with conventional male authority figures and were unprepared for her combination of intelligence, determination, and diplomatic skill. The railroad negotiations revealed Emma's growing sophistication as a leader. She understood that the community needed economic connections to the wider world, but she also recognized the dangers of becoming dependent on outside forces they couldn't control. She insisted on terms that would allow Millbrook Valley to maintain its autonomy while benefiting from improved transportation and communication links. Samuel's technical expertise proved crucial in these discussions. His understanding of mining and industrial processes allowed him to evaluate the railroad's promises realistically and identify potential problems before they became crises. His partnership with Emma in the negotiations demonstrated the strength of their collaborative leadership model and impressed the corporate representatives with the community's competence and unity. As winter began to release its grip on the mountain valleys, Emma felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with apprehension. The approaching spring would bring new opportunities for growth and development, but it would also make Millbrook Valley accessible to the Iron Hand Gang again. Reports from territorial marshals suggested that Jack Murphy was planning something ambitious for the coming season, possibly a coordinated campaign against several targets simultaneously. The community's preparations had transformed them from helpless victims into a formidable defensive force. But Emma knew that their greatest strength lay not in weapons or fortifications, but in their unity and shared commitment to protecting what they had built together. The town that emerged from the winter was stronger, more prosperous, and more resilient than the original settlement had ever been. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not as scattered individuals, but as a true community forged by adversity and strengthened by shared purpose. Marcus and Samuel had worked through many of their old tensions during the long winter months, finding ways to complement each other's strengths rather than compete for recognition. Their partnership with Emma created a leadership structure that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the democratic principles that had become central to the community's identity. Rose's wisdom and experience provided continuity and perspective that helped everyone understand their current challenges in the context of the larger frontier experience. The approaching spring promised both opportunity and danger, but Emma faced the future with confidence born of hard-won experience. She had learned that leadership meant serving others rather than commanding them, that strength came from unity rather than individual prowess, and that the most powerful response to destruction was the patient work of building something better. Millbrook Valley had become more than just a town rebuilt from ruins. It had become a demonstration that ordinary people could create extraordinary communities when they refused to surrender to fear and despair. Spring arrived in Millbrook Valley with a rush of melting snow and the sound of Swift Creek running. High and fast through the center of town, Emma stood on the newly constructed bridge, watching the swollen waters carry away the last remnants of winter while mountain flowers began to bloom along the banks. The transformation was remarkable, not just in the landscape, but in the town itself. What had been a collection of hastily repaired buildings and temporary shelters now resembled a proper settlement with straight streets, solid foundations, and the kind of purposeful activity that spoke of permanent residents rather than transient survivors. The morning brought disturbing news that shattered the peaceful atmosphere. Tom Bradley, one of their regular scouts, rode in with his horse lathered and his face grim with urgency. He had spotted campfire smoke rising from Devil's Canyon, the same remote location where Samuel had salvaged mining equipment the previous autumn. More troubling still, he had seen fresh tracks leading toward the canyon from 3 different directions, suggesting a coordinated gathering of significant size. Emma called an emergency meeting of the town council, which now included herself, Marcus, Samuel, Rose, and 3 elected representatives from different sections of the community. They gathered in the church as dawn light filtered through the stained glass windows that had been painstakingly restored over the winter months. The irony wasn't lost on Emma that they were planning for potential violence in a place dedicated to peace. But she had learned that protecting good things sometimes required difficult choices. Marcus spread a hand-drawn map across the altar, marking the canyon location and the various trails that led to it. His years of military service had taught him to think systematically about terrain, supply lines, and tactical advantages. Samuel contributed his knowledge of the canyon's layout from his equipment salvage expedition, while Rose offered insights about seasonal patterns and weather conditions that could affect any confrontation. The discussion revealed just how much the community had grown in both size and capability since the previous autumn. They now numbered 47 families, including several groups of skilled craftsmen who had been attracted by stories of the town's remarkable recovery. Among the newcomers were 2 former army sergeants, a telegraph operator, a doctor who had lost her practice in a fire down in Colorado Springs, and a group of German immigrants whose metalworking skills complemented Samuel's mining operations. Emma found herself thinking not just about immediate defensive needs, but about the broader implications of whatever was happening in Devil's Canyon. If the Iron Hand Gang was indeed gathering there, it suggested a level of organization and planning that went beyond their usual opportunistic raids. Jack Murphy might be preparing for something ambitious, possibly targeting multiple settlements simultaneously or attempting to establish a permanent base of operations in the region. The strategic situation was complicated by the fact that Millbrook Valley's success had made it a natural target for criminal attention. The mining operations were generating visible prosperity, the railroad negotiations had attracted outside investment, and the community's reputation for effective self-governance had drawn settlers from throughout the territory. They had built something worth stealing, which meant they had also painted a target on themselves. Dr. Sarah Chen, the physician who had joined them in late winter, brought a perspective that none of the others had considered. Her experience treating victims of outlaw violence in other communities had taught her that gangs like Murphy's often used psychological warfare as much as direct attacks. The gathering in Devil's Canyon might be intended to create fear and uncertainty, forcing the community to spend resources on defense rather than development. The possibility that they were being manipulated made Emma angry in a way that surprised her. She had spent months building something positive from the ashes of destruction, creating opportunities for people to live decent lives and contribute to something larger than themselves. The idea that criminals would try to destroy that progress for their own selfish gain struck her as a kind of evil that needed to be confronted directly rather than simply endured. Samuel proposed a reconnaissance mission to determine exactly what they were facing. His mining work had made him familiar with the canyon's terrain and geology, and he was confident he could get close enough to gather useful intelligence without being detected. Marcus supported the idea, but insisted on going along, arguing that military reconnaissance required specific skills that were different from civilian exploration. The debate over the reconnaissance mission revealed some of the tensions that had been building beneath the surface of the community's success. Several newer residents questioned whether they should be taking aggressive action at all, suggesting instead that they should focus on defense and let territorial authorities handle any criminal activity. Others argued that waiting for outside help was exactly the kind of passive response that had allowed the original town to be destroyed. Emma found herself in the difficult position of mediating between different visions of how the community should respond to external threats. Her natural inclination was toward careful planning and consensus building, but she also recognized that some situations required decisive leadership, even when not everyone agreed with the chosen course of action. The skills she had developed as a teacher proved relevant as she worked to help people articulate their concerns and find common ground. Rose's intervention proved crucial in resolving the debate. Her frontier experience gave her credibility with both the cautious newcomers and the more aggressive old-timers, and her relationship with Emma allowed her to speak frankly about the realities of frontier life. She reminded everyone that territorial law enforcement was spread thin across vast distances, and that communities that couldn't defend themselves often didn't survive long enough for outside help to arrive. The decision to proceed with reconnaissance was ultimately unanimous, but it came with conditions that reflected the community's commitment to collective decision-making. Samuel and Marcus would go together, reducing the risk to either individual, while ensuring that they could provide backup for each other. They would gather information only, avoiding any action that might provoke premature conflict. Most importantly, they would report back to the full community before any further decisions were made. While the reconnaissance mission was being planned, Emma focused on strengthening the town's defensive capabilities and maintaining normal community activities. She had learned from Rose that one of the most important aspects of leadership during crisis was preserving a sense of normalcy and hope for the future. People needed to feel that they were living their lives rather than simply surviving from one emergency to the next. The school continued to operate with expanded enrollment, as families who had arrived over the winter brought children eager for education. Emma had hired 2 additional teachers, allowing them to offer more advanced courses and technical training alongside basic literacy and arithmetic. The mining operations required workers who could read technical manuals and perform mathematical calculations, creating a practical demand for education that went beyond abstract intellectual development. The success of the educational program had attracted attention from territorial education officials, who were considering Millbrook Valley as a site for a regional training institute. The possibility of becoming an educational center would bring prestige and economic opportunities, but it would also make the community an even more attractive target for criminal elements who saw educated populations as sources of both wealth and potential resistance. Emma's correspondence with territorial officials had also revealed disturbing patterns in outlaw activity throughout the region. The Iron Hand Gang, was apparently part of a larger network of criminal organizations that were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their operations. Rather than random violence and opportunistic theft, they were beginning to engage in coordinated campaigns that resembled military operations more than traditional banditry. The implications were sobering. If criminal organizations were becoming more organized and strategic, then isolated communities would need to develop corresponding capabilities for defense and mutual support. Emma began reaching out to leaders in other settlements, exploring the possibility of creating a regional coalition that could share intelligence and coordinate responses to large-scale threats. Samuel and Marcus departed for their reconnaissance mission on a clear morning when mountain visibility was excellent and weather conditions were stable. They took minimal equipment and supplies, planning to complete their observation and return. Within 2 days, Emma watched them disappear into the forest with a mixture of pride and anxiety, knowing that the information they gathered would determine how the community prepared for whatever was coming. The waiting period tested everyone's nerves. Normal activities continued, but with an undercurrent of tension that affected everything from casual conversations to work productivity. Emma made a point of maintaining her usual routines, teaching classes and conducting community business as if nothing unusual was happening. Her calm demeanor helped stabilize others, though privately, she found the uncertainty almost unbearable. Dr. Chen used the time to expand the community's medical preparedness, training additional people in basic first aid and wound treatment, while stockpiling supplies that might be needed if violence occurred. Her clinical approach to potential casualties was both reassuring and sobering, forcing everyone to confront the reality that their peaceful community might soon become a battlefield. The German metalworkers, led by Heinrich Weber, accelerated their production of defensive equipment and weapons. Their skills in precision manufacturing allowed them to create ammunition and repair firearms with a quality that impressed even the Civil War veterans. More importantly, they began training other community members in basic metalworking and equipment maintenance, ensuring that defensive capabilities could be sustained over time. Rose organized the women of the community into support networks that could function effectively during emergencies. Her frontier experience had taught her that successful defense required not just armed resistance, but also efficient systems for communication, supply distribution, medical care, and civilian protection. The networks she established were designed to operate independently if necessary, ensuring that community functions could continue even if key leaders were killed or disabled. Emma's role during this period evolved into something resembling wartime leadership, though she was careful not to let crisis management overshadow the community's commitment to democratic governance. She consulted regularly with the elected council and made sure that major decisions were explained and justified to the broader population. Her transparency and accountability helped maintain unity and morale during a period when authoritarian leadership might have seemed more efficient. The return of Samuel and Marcus brought news that was both better and worse than anyone had expected. The good news was that the Iron Hand Gang was indeed gathering in Devil's Canyon, but their numbers were smaller than the extensive track evidence had suggested. The bad news was that they were being joined by members of at least 2 other outlaw groups, creating a temporary alliance that was larger and more dangerous than any single gang. More troubling still was evidence that the criminal alliance was receiving support from someone with significant resources and inside knowledge of territorial affairs. Their camp was too well supplied and organized to be a spontaneous gathering, and they had detailed information about railroad schedules and territorial marshal movements that suggested corruption or infiltration of official channels. The intelligence gathered by Samuel and Marcus indicated that the criminal alliance was planning a coordinated campaign against multiple targets, with Millbrook Valley being the primary objective due to its visible prosperity and strategic location. The attacks were scheduled to coincide with a period when territorial law enforcement would be concentrated in Denver for a major trial, leaving the rural areas temporarily unprotected. Emma realized that they were facing a threat that went beyond simple criminal opportunism. This was an organized challenge to the rule of law and civilian authority throughout the region. The response would need to be correspondingly sophisticated, requiring not just local defense, but coordination with other communities and territorial authorities to address the broader threat. The community meeting called to discuss the reconnaissance findings was the largest and most serious gathering in Millbrook Valley's history. Representatives from every family attended, along with several visitors from neighboring settlements who had heard rumors of the impending threat. Emma opened the meeting by presenting the facts clearly and completely, making sure that everyone understood both the immediate danger and the larger implications. The discussion that followed revealed the full measure of how much the community had grown and matured since the previous year's crisis. Instead of panic or defeatism, the response was characterized by careful analysis, systematic planning, and quiet determination to protect what they had built together. People asked practical questions about defensive capabilities, supply requirements, and coordination with outside authorities. Most importantly, there was no serious discussion of abandoning the town or surrendering to the threat. The dawn sky over Millbrook Valley glowed crimson as Emma stood atop the church bell tower, watching the horizon through Marcus's military field glasses. 3 days had passed since their scouts reported movement in the southern passes, and now dust clouds on the distant ridges confirmed what everyone had feared. Jack Murphy's enlarged criminal alliance was finally making their move, and they were coming in numbers that dwarfed anything the town had faced before. Emma climbed down from the tower and walked through streets that hummed with purposeful activity. Every resident knew their assigned role in the defense plan, and the months of preparation were evident in the calm efficiency with which people went about their tasks. Children were being moved to the reinforced basement of the school building, while their mothers checked ammunition supplies and communication equipment one final time. The men took their positions along the carefully planned defensive perimeter, their faces grim but determined. The transformation of Millbrook Valley into a fortress had been accomplished without sacrificing its character as a community. Barricades had been constructed to channel attackers into kill zones while preserving the town's essential functions. The church still served as a meeting place and spiritual center, but its tower now housed a signal station and weapons cache. The school remained dedicated to education, but its basement had become the town's most secure shelter. Every building served dual purposes, reflecting the residents' determination to defend their way of life rather than simply survive another attack. Dr. Chen had established a field hospital in the general store, taking advantage of its central location and large open space. Her medical training had been supplemented by battlefield experience gained from treating victims of outlaw raids throughout the territory. She worked with quiet competence, assisted by women who had learned surgical techniques and trauma care. During the long winter months, their presence provided reassurance to everyone who might need medical attention in the coming battle. Samuel's mining operations had provided an unexpected advantage in the form of explosive charges that could be used to block access routes or create diversions. His engineering background allowed him to calculate precise amounts of dynamite needed to collapse specific sections of the canyon approaches without causing broader environmental damage. The explosives were carefully positioned and connected to a centralized detonation system that could be triggered from the church tower. Marcus coordinated the overall defensive strategy with the calm professionalism that had made him a respected cavalry scout. His network of lookouts provided continuous intelligence about enemy movements, while his communication system ensured that every defender knew exactly when and where to expect attack. The Civil War veterans who had joined the community provided squad-level leadership, their combat experience invaluable in preparing other residents for the realities of armed conflict. Rose Mackenzie had taken charge of civilian coordination and morale, drawing on decades of frontier experience to anticipate problems and maintain community cohesion under extreme stress. Her wisdom and steady presence helped calm fears while ensuring that essential functions like food distribution and childcare continued even as the town prepared for battle. She understood that preserving normal routines was crucial for maintaining the psychological strength needed for effective resistance. The first contact came at mid-morning when outlying scouts reported that advance elements of the criminal alliance had reached the valley's outer perimeter. Emma received the news in the church, where she had established a command center that allowed her to coordinate with all parts of the defensive network. Her transformation from schoolteacher to military commander had been gradual but complete, and she now possessed the kind of quiet authority that inspired confidence even in experienced fighters. The enemy's approach revealed the sophisticated planning that had characterized their entire campaign. Rather than the wild frontal assault that had destroyed the original town, they advanced methodically, using cover and coordinated movement to minimize their exposure to defensive fire. Their numbers were indeed larger than any single outlaw gang, and their equipment suggested access to resources that went far beyond typical criminal operations. Emma's strategic response demonstrated how much she had learned about leadership under pressure. Instead of trying to control every aspect of the defense personally, she focused on maintaining communication between different elements of the plan and ensuring that local commanders had the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. Her role was to coordinate and inspire rather than micromanage, trusting in the competence and dedication of people she had come to know as both neighbors and fellow defenders. The battle began in earnest when the criminal alliance launched probing attacks against 3 different sections of the perimeter simultaneously. Their goal was clearly to identify weak points and force the defenders to reveal their capabilities and dispositions. Emma watched from the church tower as muzzle flashes erupted along the defensive lines, the sound of gunfire echoing off the surrounding mountains like thunder during a violent storm. Marcus's defensive plan proved its worth, as the probing attacks were repelled with minimal casualties among the defenders. The carefully prepared kill zones channeled the attackers into positions where concentrated fire could be brought to bear, while the communication system allowed rapid reinforcement of any threatened position. The outlaws found themselves facing determined resistance that was far more organized and effective than they had expected. Jack Murphy's response to the initial repulse revealed both his tactical competence and his growing desperation. Rather than continuing with probing attacks, he committed his entire force to a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers and firepower. The criminal alliance charged toward the town from multiple directions, their war cries echoing across the valley as they sought to break through the defensive perimeter by force. Emma's moment of greatest test came as she watched the massive assault develop. Every instinct told her to seek shelter or flee to safety, but her responsibility to the community demanded that she remain visible and accessible to coordinate the defense. She stood in the church tower, exposed to enemy fire, but able to observe the entire battlefield and direct reinforcements where they were most needed. Her courage under fire inspired everyone who could see her. proving that their teacher had indeed become a warrior worthy of following. The climactic phase of the battle raged for nearly 3 hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The defenders' superior positions and preparation were offset by the attackers' numerical superiority and desperation. Casualties mounted on both sides as the fight devolved into a brutal contest of endurance and will. Emma found herself making life-and-death decisions about resource allocation and tactical priorities, choices that would have been unimaginable during her quiet years as a schoolteacher. The turning point came when Samuel triggered the explosive charges that sealed off the eastern approach to the town. The carefully calculated detonation collapsed a section of canyon wall, trapping nearly a third of the attacking force and eliminating their ability to coordinate with the main assault. The psychological impact of the explosion was as important as its tactical effect, demonstrating to the outlaws that they were facing opponents who possessed both the will and capability to employ sophisticated defensive measures. Murphy's reaction to the explosion revealed the desperation that had been driving his increasingly ambitious criminal enterprises. Rather than withdrawing in the face of effective resistance, he committed his remaining reserves in a final assault against the town's main defensive line. His decision reflected both tactical incompetence and the kind of personal obsession that had made him a dangerous enemy. He seemed determined to destroy Millbrook Valley, even if it meant sacrificing his entire organization in the process. The final assault nearly succeeded through sheer intensity and Murphy's willingness to accept massive casualties. The outlaws breached the outer defensive perimeter at 2 points, forcing hand-to-hand combat in the streets of the town itself. Emma descended from the church tower to join the fighting, wielding a rifle with the same determination she had once brought to teaching arithmetic and reading. Her presence in the battle lines provided a rallying point for defenders who might otherwise have been overwhelmed by the ferocity of the attack. Dr. Chen's field hospital became a crucial factor in maintaining defensive effectiveness as wounded defenders were quickly treated and returned to the fight when possible. Her medical expertise kept casualty rates lower than they might have been, while her calm professionalism under fire provided an example of grace under pressure that inspired everyone who witnessed it. The women who had trained as medical assistants proved their worth by working efficiently, even as gunfire erupted around their makeshift surgical tables. The decisive moment came when Marcus led a counterattack that drove the outlaws back from their breakthrough points and trapped Murphy himself in the town square. The outlaw leader found himself surrounded by people he had tried to terrorize, facing the kind of justice that was rarely available on the frontier. His capture marked the effective end of organized resistance as his remaining followers scattered into the wilderness rather than continuing a hopeless fight. Emma's confrontation with Murphy revealed how completely she had been transformed by her experiences. The frightened schoolteacher who had once hidden from violence was gone, replaced by a leader who could face down a notorious criminal without flinching. Her words to Murphy were measured but firm, making it clear that Millbrook Valley would no longer tolerate threats from his kind. She offered him the choice between surrender and continued resistance, but her tone made it clear which option she expected him to choose. The aftermath of the battle demonstrated the strength of the community that had been forged through shared adversity. Instead of celebrating victory through violence or revenge, the residents focused immediately on caring for wounded and repairing damage to their town. Murphy and his surviving followers were disarmed and secured, but they were also provided with medical care and basic necessities, while arrangements were made for their transfer to territorial authorities. Emma's leadership during the post-battle period proved as important as her role during the fighting itself. She organized recovery efforts with the same systematic approach that had characterized the defense, ensuring that essential services were restored quickly while long-term repairs were planned and executed efficiently. Her ability to transition seamlessly from wartime commander to peacetime administrator demonstrated the depth of her growth as a leader. The news of Millbrook Valley's successful defense spread rapidly throughout the territory, attracting attention from territorial officials, newspaper reporters, and other communities that were struggling with similar threats. Emma found herself corresponding with territorial governors and federal marshals, sharing intelligence about criminal networks and coordinating regional security measures. Her reputation as an effective leader brought opportunities for broader influence and responsibility. The railroad negotiations that had been interrupted by the crisis resumed with Emma in a much stronger position. The successful defense had demonstrated the community's stability and competence, making it an attractive partner for development projects. Emma used her enhanced leverage to secure better terms for the railroad agreement while maintaining the community's autonomy and character. Samuel's mining operations expanded rapidly as word of the town's success attracted investors and skilled workers from throughout the region. The combination of mineral wealth, strategic location, and effective governance made Millbrook Valley an increasingly important economic center. Samuel's partnership with Emma in managing this growth ensured that prosperity was shared broadly rather than concentrated among a few individuals. Marcus accepted a position as territorial deputy marshal, using his military experience and knowledge of criminal networks to coordinate law enforcement efforts across a wide area. His base remained in Millbrook Valley, where his relationship with Emma continued to deepen into a true partnership that combined personal affection with shared commitment to community service. Dr. Chen established a regional medical training center that attracted students from throughout the territory. Her combination of clinical expertise and battlefield experience made her an ideal instructor for the frontier medicine that was desperately needed in isolated communities. The medical center became another source of prestige and economic opportunity for Millbrook Valley. Rose Mackenzie's wisdom and experience made her a natural choice for Territorial Education Commissioner, a position that allowed her to spread the innovative educational approaches that had been developed in Millbrook Valley to other communities throughout the region. Her appointment reflected the broader recognition that the town had become a model for effective frontier community development. Emma's final transformation was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The woman who had begun as a simple school teacher had become a regional leader whose influence extended far beyond her own community. She was consulted on territorial policy, invited to speak at educational conferences, and courted by political organizations that recognized her potential for even higher office. Yet she remained grounded in the community that had shaped her, understanding that her effectiveness as a leader depended on maintaining her connection to the people she served. The town that emerged from the crisis was stronger, more prosperous, and more influential than the original Millbrook Valley had ever been. It had become a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people refused to surrender to adversity and instead chose to build something better from the ruins of what they had lost. Emma's journey from victim to survivor to leader to community builder demonstrated that the most powerful response to destruction was not revenge or escape, but the patient work of creating something worth defending. The autumn sun cast long golden shadows across the bustling streets of Millbrook Valley as Emma walked through what had become the most prosperous and influential settlement in the entire Colorado Territory. 2 years had passed since the decisive battle that had broken the Iron Hand Gang alliance, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. What had once been a struggling frontier town of 200 souls had grown into a thriving community of over 800 residents, complete with paved streets, electric lighting powered by Samuel's innovative hydroelectric system, and a telegraph office that connected them to Denver, San Francisco, and even New York City. Emma paused at the corner of Main Street and Education Avenue, watching children stream out of the 3-story brick schoolhouse that had replaced her modest one-room classroom. The Millbrook Valley Educational Institute now served students from across the territory, offering everything from basic literacy to advanced engineering courses. The sound of young voices speaking English, Spanish, German, and Chinese reflected the diverse population that had been drawn to the community by its reputation for tolerance, opportunity, and effective governance. The Institute's success had attracted the attention of Eastern philanthropists and educational reformers who saw in Emma's work a model for how frontier communities could become centers of learning and cultural development. Just last month, she had received a letter from the Carnegie Foundation expressing interest in funding an expansion that would include a library, observatory, and technical research facility. The proposal represented resources that could transform not just Millbrook Valley, but the entire region's approach to education and development. Dr. Sarah Chen approached from the direction of the Regional Medical Center, her face beaming with the satisfaction that came from another successful day of training frontier physicians and nurses. The medical facility had grown from her improvised field hospital into a sophisticated complex that served communities throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Her innovative approaches to wilderness medicine and trauma care had been documented in medical journals and were being taught in universities as far away as Boston and Philadelphia. "Emma, I have wonderful news," Dr. Chen announced as she reached the corner. "The territorial governor has approved our proposal for the nursing college. We'll be able to train qualified medical professionals for every settlement from here to the Pacific Coast. The federal government is providing funding because they recognize how crucial medical infrastructure is for territorial development and eventual statehood." Emma smiled at her friend's enthusiasm, remembering the desperate woman who had arrived in Millbrook Valley with nothing but her medical bag and a determination to rebuild her life. Dr. Chen's journey from refugee to regional medical director paralleled Emma's own transformation, demonstrating how crisis could forge people into leaders they never imagined they could become. The friendship between them had deepened over years of shared challenges and mutual support, creating a bond that transcended their professional collaborations. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus, who had just returned from a 2-week circuit of the territory in his capacity as senior deputy marshal. His face showed the weariness that came from long days in the saddle, but his eyes held the satisfaction of a man who knew his work was making a difference. The criminal networks that had once terrorized isolated communities were largely broken, replaced by effective law enforcement and communication systems that made coordinated resistance possible. "The Henderson family sends their gratitude," Marcus reported as he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. "The community defense techniques we taught them worked perfectly when the Morrison gang tried to hit their settlement last month. They drove off the attack without a single casualty and captured 3 of the outlaws for transport to Denver. Word is spreading that frontier communities don't have to be helpless victims anymore." Emma felt a surge of pride at the news, though she was careful not to let it show too obviously. The community defense training program that Millbrook Valley had developed was being adopted throughout the territory, empowering settlements to protect themselves while reducing the burden on overextended territorial law enforcement. The program's success had led to requests for consultation from territories as far away as Montana and New Mexico, spreading the model that had proven so effective in Colorado. Samuel emerged from the offices of the Rocky Mountain Mining and Development Company, his clothes dusty from a morning spent in the expanded operations that now employed over 200 people directly and supported hundreds more in subsidiary businesses. The mining venture had grown far beyond the simple ore extraction that had started during their first desperate winter, evolving into a diversified operation that included mineral processing, equipment manufacturing, and technical consulting services. The railroad executives are arriving tomorrow for the final negotiations, Samuel announced, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They're prepared to offer terms that would make Millbrook Valley the primary supply and administrative center for the entire southern Colorado rail network. The economic opportunities would be enormous, but we need to make sure we maintain control over our own development. The railroad negotiations represented both the culmination of Emma's leadership and her greatest challenge. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway Company had initially approached Millbrook Valley as a minor supply stop, but the community's growth and strategic importance had transformed the discussions into something much more significant. The proposed agreement would bring unprecedented prosperity and growth, but it would also attract outside pressures and influences that could threaten the democratic, cooperative values that had made the community successful. Emma had spent months preparing for these final negotiations, consulting with territorial lawyers, studying contracts from other rail development projects, and building consensus within the community about acceptable terms and non-negotiable principles. Her approach reflected the collaborative leadership style that had emerged from years of crisis management and community building. Major decisions were made transparently, with extensive input from affected stakeholders and careful attention to long-term consequences. Rose McKenzie approached the group with the measured pace of someone whose frontier wisdom had earned respect throughout the territory. Her appointment as Territorial Education Commissioner had given her a platform to advocate for the innovative educational approaches pioneered in Millbrook Valley, but she remained actively involved in the community's governance and development. Her perspective was particularly valuable during complex negotiations because she understood both the opportunities and the dangers of rapid growth. "I've been reviewing the railroad contracts from settlements in Kansas and Nebraska," Rose reported, her voice carrying the authority that came from decades of frontier experience. "The patterns are clear. Communities that maintain local control and diversified economies prosper in the long term, while those that become dependent on single industries or outside corporations often struggle when circumstances change. We need to negotiate terms that preserve our autonomy while taking advantage of the opportunities." The discussion that followed demonstrated how much the community's leadership had matured since the desperate early days of rebuilding. Instead of making decisions based on immediate needs or emotional reactions, they were able to analyze complex economic and political factors systematically. Emma's role had evolved from crisis manager to strategic planner, coordinating different perspectives and expertise to develop comprehensive approaches to multifaceted challenges. Heinrich Weber joined the conversation as representatives from the German immigrant community that had become integral to Millbrook Valley's industrial development. His metalworking and precision manufacturing operations had grown into enterprises that supplied specialized equipment to mining operations throughout the Western Territories. His workers had established their own neighborhood with distinctive architecture and cultural traditions, contributing to the community's diversity while maintaining their own identity. "The railroad representatives will be impressed by our manufacturing capabilities," Heinrich observed in his careful English. "But we must ensure that any agreements preserve our ability to serve customers throughout the region, not just railroad needs. Diversification has made us strong, and we cannot allow outside interests to force us into narrow specialization that could make us vulnerable to economic changes. Emma nodded appreciatively at Heinrich's insight, recognizing how his business perspective complemented the other viewpoints being offered. The community's success had been built on the principle that multiple perspectives and diverse skills were stronger than any single approach, no matter how expertly executed. The leadership group that had emerged reflected this diversity, bringing together different backgrounds, experiences, and areas of expertise in service of shared goals. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a telegram from the territorial capital, delivered by young Timothy Morrison, who had grown from a frightened refugee child into a confident young man training to become a telegraph operator. The message contained news that would have seemed impossible during the community's darkest hours. Emma had been invited to address the Territorial Constitutional Convention, where delegates were drafting the documents that would transform Colorado. From territory to state, the invitation represented recognition that Millbrook Valley's innovative approaches to community governance, economic development, and social organization had broader implications for territorial development. Emma's expertise in building democratic institutions, managing diverse populations, and balancing individual rights with collective needs was exactly what the Constitutional Convention needed as delegates wrestled with fundamental questions about how the new state should be organized. Dr. Chen was the first to break the surprised silence that followed the telegram's announcement. "This is extraordinary recognition, Emma. Your work here has demonstrated that frontier communities can be more than just temporary arrangements for resource extraction. You've shown that democratic governance and cooperative economics can create lasting prosperity and social stability. The Constitutional Convention needs those insights." Marcus's reaction reflected both pride and concern about the broader implications of Emma's growing influence. "The invitation is well-deserved recognition of your leadership, but it also represents new responsibilities and challenges. If you address the Constitutional Convention, you'll be speaking not just for Millbrook Valley, but for communities throughout the Western Territories. The words you choose could influence the fundamental structure of the new state." Samuel's response demonstrated how the brothers' relationship had evolved from competition to mutual support and respect. "Whatever you decide about the Constitutional Convention, you have our complete support. But remember that your most important work remains here in Millbrook Valley. We've built something special, and maintaining it requires constant attention and leadership. Don't let outside opportunities distract you from the foundation that makes everything else possible." Rose's wisdom proved crucial in helping Emma think through the implications of the invitation and its relationship to her other responsibilities. Leadership sometimes requires making difficult choices about where to focus time and energy. You've proven that you can build and maintain a successful community, but the question now is whether you can help build and maintain a successful state. The skills are related, but not identical, and the stakes are much higher. The discussion continued as they walked toward the town hall, an impressive two-story building that had been constructed using locally quarried stone and timber from the community's own sawmill. The building's design reflected both practical frontier needs and aspirations toward civic grandeur, with meeting rooms large enough to accommodate the entire population for important community discussions and offices for the various departments that managed municipal services. Emma's office occupied a corner of the second floor, with windows that provided views of both the bustling commercial district and the residential neighborhoods where families had built homes and established roots. The walls were decorated with photographs documenting the community's growth and development, from the ruins left by the Iron Hand Gang to the thriving settlement that had emerged through collective effort and shared vision. As they settled into chairs around the large table that had been crafted by local woodworkers, Emma reflected on how much had changed since those desperate early days when survival had been their only goal. The community that had emerged was stronger, more prosperous, and more influential than anyone could have imagined, but it had also become more complex and faced new types of challenges that required different kinds of leadership and decision-making. The Territorial Constitutional Convention invitation forced Emma to confront questions about her own future and the relationship between personal ambition and community service. Her work in Millbrook Valley had prepared her for broader leadership roles, but accepting those opportunities would necessarily require her to spend less time on the local concerns that had been her primary focus for so many years. Dr. Chen had wrestled with similar questions when medical schools in Denver and San Francisco had offered her prestigious positions that would have advanced her career but taken her away from the frontier communities that needed her services. Her decision to stay and build the regional medical center had ultimately provided greater influence and impact than any individual career advancement could have offered. Marcus faced comparable choices as federal law enforcement agencies had recognized his expertise and offered positions that would have provided more authority and better compensation than his territorial deputy marshal role. His decision to focus on regional criminal justice coordination had proved more effective than pursuing individual advancement within established bureaucratic structures. Samuel's mining and engineering expertise had attracted offers from major corporations that would have made him wealthy, but required him to abandon the community-based approach to development that had made Millbrook Valley successful. His choice to expand locally while maintaining democratic ownership structures had created more lasting prosperity for more people than any corporate position could have provided. Rose's appointment as Territorial Education Commissioner had offered opportunities for broader influence, but she had negotiated terms that allowed her to remain based in Millbrook Valley while traveling throughout the territory. Her approach demonstrated that it was possible to accept expanded responsibilities without abandoning local commitments, though it required careful balance and constant attention to competing priorities. The conversation about the Constitutional Convention invitation continued through the afternoon as they were joined by other community leaders and ordinary residents who had insights to contribute. The discussion reflected the collaborative decision-making processes that had become central to Millbrook Valley's governance, with important choices being made through extensive consultation and consensus building rather than individual authority. Emma found herself thinking not just about the immediate question of whether to accept the invitation, but about the broader implications of success and growth for communities that had been built on principles of cooperation and shared responsibility. Millbrook Valley's achievements had been recognized throughout the territory and beyond, attracting attention that brought both opportunities and challenges. The success had attracted new residents whose motivations and values didn't always align with the cooperative principles that had guided the community's development. Some newcomers were drawn primarily by economic opportunities and showed little interest in the democratic governance and community service that had made those opportunities possible. Managing this tension required constant attention and creative approaches to integration and education. The community's growing influence had also attracted political attention from territorial and federal officials who wanted to understand and possibly replicate the innovations that had made Millbrook Valley successful. While this recognition was gratifying, it also created pressure to conform to external expectations and standards that might not be appropriate for local conditions and values. Emma's personal growth from schoolteacher to community leader, territorial figure, had paralleled the community's development, but it had also created new responsibilities and expectations that sometimes conflicted with her original motivations and commitments. The invitation to address the Constitutional Convention represented the culmination of this trajectory, but it also forced her to choose between different visions of leadership and service. The evening community meeting that was called to discuss the Constitutional Convention invitation drew the largest attendance in Millbrook Valley's history. The town hall was packed to capacity, with additional residents gathering outside to listen through open windows and doors. The diversity of the crowd reflected how much the community had grown and changed, with faces representing dozens of different backgrounds, nationalities, and occupations. Emma opened the meeting by reading the invitation aloud and explaining its significance for both the community and the broader territory. She was careful to present the opportunity objectively, without revealing her own inclinations or preferences. The decision would affect everyone in Millbrook Valley, and she wanted to ensure that all perspectives were heard and considered before any choices were made. The discussion that followed demonstrated both the strengths and the challenges of democratic governance in a diverse, rapidly growing community. Older residents who had lived through the rebuilding process understood the importance of maintaining local focus and continuity of leadership. Newer residents were more interested in the prestige and opportunities that Emma's expanded influence could bring to the community. Business owners and entrepreneurs saw the Constitutional Convention invitation as validation of Millbrook Valley's economic success and an opportunity to attract additional investment and development. Families with children were concerned about maintaining the educational and cultural institutions that had made the community attractive to them. Workers and craftsmen wanted assurance that growth and change wouldn't threaten their economic security or political influence. Religious and cultural minority groups valued the tolerance and inclusion that had characterized Emma's leadership and worried that her absence could threaten the community's commitment to diversity and individual rights. Recent immigrants appreciated the opportunities for economic advancement and civic participation that Millbrook Valley provided, but they also needed continued support for language learning and cultural adaptation. The debate continued for several hours, with Emma facilitating discussion while being careful not to influence the outcome through her own comments or reactions. Her role was to ensure that all viewpoints were heard and that the eventual decision reflected genuine community consensus rather than the preferences of the most vocal or influential individuals. Dr. Chen's contribution to the discussion proved particularly valuable because of her outsider's perspective on the community's achievements and significance. "What Emma has accomplished here isn't just local success," she observed. "It's a demonstration that democratic governance and cooperative economics can work on the frontier. If those lessons can be incorporated into the new state's constitution, they could influence community development throughout the Western Territories and beyond." Marcus approached the question from his law enforcement perspective, emphasizing the importance of maintaining local stability and continuity during a period of rapid territorial change. "Emma's leadership has been crucial to our success, but it's also created systems and institutions that can function effectively even when she's traveling or focused on other responsibilities. The question isn't whether she can serve both local and territorial needs, but whether she wants to take on that broader role." Samuel's business background led him to focus on the economic implications of Emma's potential expanded role. The Constitutional Convention invitation reflects recognition that could bring significant benefits to our community, but we need to make sure that any new responsibilities don't interfere with the local leadership that made those benefits possible in the first place. Success breeds new challenges, and we need to be prepared for them. Rose's historical perspective helped frame the discussion in terms of long-term patterns and precedents. Frontier communities that produce effective leaders often face the choice between keeping those leaders locally or allowing them to serve broader constituencies. The communities that handle this transition successfully are those that develop strong institutional structures and shared leadership capabilities that don't depend entirely on individual personalities. Heinrich Weber's immigrant perspective added another dimension to the discussion by highlighting how community leadership affected different groups within the population. Emma's approach to leadership has made Millbrook Valley welcoming to people from many backgrounds and countries. This inclusiveness has been crucial to our economic and social success. We need to ensure that any changes preserve this character and continue to provide opportunities for all residents. The discussion revealed broad support for Emma's acceptance of the Constitutional Convention invitation, but also deep concern about maintaining community stability and continuity. The eventual consensus reflected the sophisticated understanding of governance and leadership that had developed through years of collaborative decision-making and shared responsibility. The community voted to support Emma's participation in the Constitutional Convention, while also establishing additional structures to ensure continuity of local leadership during her absence. A rotating council system would handle day-to-day governance, with different individuals taking responsibility for specific areas of community management. Regular communication between the Constitutional Convention and the community would keep residents informed about developments and allow input on issues affecting local interests. Emma's acceptance speech demonstrated how much she had grown as both a leader and a public speaker since her early days as a frontier school teacher. Instead of focusing on personal achievement or individual recognition, she emphasized the collective nature of Millbrook Valley's success and the shared principles that had made their community a model for democratic governance and cooperative development. "What we have built here belongs to all of us," Emma declared to the packed town hall. "The invitation to address the Constitutional Convention isn't recognition of individual leadership, but acknowledgement of what we have accomplished together. The principles we have proven here, democratic governance, cooperative economics, inclusive community building, and effective collective defense, these are the foundations that the new state needs to incorporate into its fundamental structure." Walsh, the weeks leading up to Emma's departure for the Constitutional Convention were filled with intensive preparation and planning. She worked with territorial lawyers and constitutional scholars to understand the complex legal and political issues that would be debated. She consulted with community leaders throughout the territory to understand different perspectives on statehood and governance. Most importantly, she spent time with Millbrook Valley residents, listening to their concerns and priorities for the new state constitution. The research and consultation process revealed how much Emma had learned about leadership, governance, and community building during her years in Millbrook Valley. Her insights into democratic decision-making, economic cooperation, and social inclusion had been developed through practical experience rather than theoretical study, giving her a unique perspective on how constitutional principles could be implemented effectively at the community level. Emma's relationship with Marcus deepened during this period, as they both recognized that her expanding role would require adjustments to their personal and professional partnership. Their bond had been forged through shared crisis and community building, but it would need to evolve to accommodate new responsibilities and different types of challenges. Their conversations about the future reflected both their individual growth and their continued commitment to shared values and goals. The farewell gathering, organized by the community, demonstrated how much Emma had come to mean to people whose lives had been transformed by her leadership and example. Stories were shared about specific moments when her guidance had made crucial differences, from the earliest days of rebuilding through the complex challenges of managing growth and success. The testimonials revealed the depth of impact that effective leadership could have on individual lives and community development. Dr. Chen's farewell speech captured the essence of Emma's transformation and its significance for the broader territory. When Emma first arrived in Millbrook Valley, she was a schoolteacher who had lost everything to outlaw violence. But instead of accepting victimhood or pursuing revenge, she chose to build something better from the ruins of what had been destroyed. That choice, and the leadership that followed from it, has created a model that could transform the entire western frontier. Marcus's contribution emphasized the military and law enforcement perspective on Emma's achievements. What Emma accomplished. Here goes beyond successful community development. She proved that democratic governance and cooperative defense can be more effective than authoritarian control or individual heroics. The principles she has demonstrated have implications for territorial security and federal policy throughout the Western Territories. Samuel's remarks focused on the economic dimensions of his sister-in-law's leadership. Emma's approach to community development has created lasting prosperity that benefits everyone, rather than concentrating wealth among a few individuals. The economic model she has helped build could be scaled up to state and regional levels, creating the kind of broad-based development that territories need to achieve successful statehood. Rose's speech drew on her historical knowledge to place Emma's achievements in the context of frontier development patterns. Most frontier communities either fail entirely or succeed only temporarily before being replaced by more permanent settlements. What makes Millbrook Valley different is that it has achieved the stability and institutional development that characterize permanent communities while maintaining the democratic character and economic opportunity that attract new residents. Heinrich Weber's farewell emphasized the immigrant perspective on Emma's leadership and its importance for territorial development. Emma has shown that American frontier communities can welcome people from many countries and backgrounds while maintaining shared values and common purposes. This approach to community building could be crucial for the new state as it seeks to attract settlers and develop its full potential. The departure itself was both ceremonial and practical, reflecting the community's understanding that Emma's expanded role would require regular travel between Millbrook Valley and the territorial capital. A regular communication schedule would keep her informed about local developments while allowing her to share insights from the Constitutional Convention and other territorial activities. The arrangements demonstrated how the community had learned to balance local needs with broader responsibilities. Emma's journey to Denver took her through communities throughout the territory that had been influenced by Millbrook Valley's example and innovations. The settlements she visited had adopted various aspects of the democratic governance, cooperative economics, and community defense techniques that had proven successful. Her conversations with local leaders revealed both the potential and the challenges of scaling up community-level innovations to territorial and state levels. The Constitutional Convention itself proved to be both more complex and more receptive to innovative ideas than Emma had expected. Delegates represented different regions, economic interests, and political philosophies, but they shared recognition that Colorado's transition to statehood required constitutional structures appropriate for Western conditions rather than simple copying of Eastern models. Emma's address to the convention focused on the practical lessons learned through community building in Millbrook Valley, emphasizing principles that could be adapted to different scales and circumstances. Her presentation included specific examples of how democratic governance could function effectively in frontier conditions, how cooperative economics could create broad-based prosperity, and how inclusive community building could manage diversity while maintaining social cohesion. The response to Emma's presentation exceeded her expectations, with delegates from throughout the territory expressing interest in incorporating various aspects of the Millbrook Valley model into the state constitution. Her influence was particularly strong in areas related to local governance, educational policy, and economic development, where her practical experience provided insights that purely theoretical approaches couldn't match. The months of constitutional convention work proved intellectually stimulating and personally rewarding for Emma, but they also reinforced her understanding that her most important work remained at the community level. The principles and practices that had made Millbrook Valley successful could influence state and territorial policy, but their most powerful application was in the daily work of building and maintaining democratic communities. Emma's return to Millbrook Valley was celebrated as both a homecoming and recognition of expanded influence and responsibility. The community had functioned effectively during her absence, demonstrating that the institutional structures and shared leadership capabilities that had been developed could provide continuity even when key individuals were focused on other priorities. The final phase of Emma's story began with the formal adoption of the Colorado State Constitution and the community's transition from territorial to state status. The new constitutional framework incorporated many of the principles that had been proven in Millbrook Valley, providing legal foundations for democratic governance, cooperative economics, and inclusive community development throughout the new state. Emma's role in the successful Constitutional Convention led to opportunities for even broader influence, including invitations to consult with territories and states throughout the Western region. Her expertise in community building and democratic governance was recognized as valuable for frontier development from Montana to New Mexico, creating possibilities for influence that extended far beyond Colorado's boundaries. But Emma's response to these opportunities reflected the wisdom she had gained through years of community leadership and personal growth. Instead of pursuing individual advancement or broad political influence, she chose to focus on deepening and expanding the work that had already proven successful in Millbrook Valley. Her decision demonstrated understanding that sustainable change required patient, consistent work at the foundation level rather than dramatic gestures at higher levels of authority. The community that Emma had helped build continued to grow and prosper, becoming a regional center for education, healthcare, economic development, and democratic governance. The institutions and principles that had been established during the rebuilding years provided stable foundations for continued innovation and adaptation as circumstances changed and new challenges emerged. Emma's personal life found fulfillment through her marriage to Marcus and their shared commitment to community service and democratic values. Their partnership had been forged through crisis and tested through success, creating a bond that could support both individual growth and shared responsibilities. Their relationship became a model for how personal relationships could strengthen rather than compete with community commitments. The legacy that Emma created extended far beyond Millbrook Valley or even Colorado, influencing community development patterns throughout the Western Territories and providing a demonstration that democratic governance and cooperative economics could succeed under frontier conditions. Her journey from victim to survivor to community leader to regional influence had proven that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they refused to accept defeat and instead chose to build something better. The final image of Emma's story showed her standing once again in the center of Millbrook Valley, but now as a confident leader of a thriving community rather than a desperate survivor among ruins. The transformation was complete, not just in her own life, but in the lives of hundreds of people who had found opportunity, security, and meaning through the community she had helped create. The last woman standing had indeed rebuilt her town and returned stronger than before. But more importantly, she had created a model that could inspire and guide community building efforts throughout the American frontier. Mountains, casting its golden light across a valley that bore little resemblance to the desolate wasteland Emma had once called home. 5 years had passed since the Constitutional Convention, and Millbrook Valley had evolved into something that transcended even the most optimistic dreams of its early rebuilders. The settlement now stretched across 3 interconnected valleys, home to nearly 1,500 residents who'd come from every corner of the American frontier and beyond, drawn by stories of a place where democracy flourished and opportunity existed for all who were willing to work for it. Emma stood on the observation deck of the new Millbrook Valley Institute for Democratic Studies, a magnificent 4-story building constructed of locally quarried granite and crowned with a copper dome that gleamed in the morning light. The institute had become a pilgrimage destination for political theorists, community organizers, and government officials from across the nation, and even from European countries where democratic movements were gaining momentum. Scholars came to study the practical implementation of democratic governance in frontier conditions, while activists sought inspiration for their own community-building efforts. The view from the dome encompassed not just the physical transformation of the valley, but the human achievement that transformation represented. Below her, Emma could see children from a dozen different cultural backgrounds walking together toward the expanded school complex, their laughter echoing off the stone buildings as they shared jokes in the mixture of languages that had become the valley's distinctive patois. In the distance, the smokestacks of Samuel's industrial complex released clean steam into the morning air, powered by the sophisticated hydroelectric system that had made Millbrook Valley a model for sustainable frontier development. Dr. Sarah Chen approached from the medical research wing of the institute, her hair now silver, but her step still energetic as she carried the latest correspondence from the National Academy of Sciences. Her pioneering work in frontier medicine had evolved into research that was influencing medical practice throughout the developing Western territories. The techniques she had developed for treating trauma and infectious disease in resource-limited environments were being taught in medical schools from Boston to San Francisco. The invitation from the International Conference on Democratic Governance has arrived, Dr. Chen announced, holding up an official-looking envelope bearing seals from universities in London, Paris, and Berlin. They want you to present the keynote address on community-based democracy and its applications to industrial society. Emma, your work is being recognized as having implications far beyond the American frontier. Emma accepted the envelope with mixed feelings, recognizing both the honor it represented and the complexity it added to her already multifaceted responsibilities. The international recognition was gratifying, but it also represented the ongoing tension between local commitments and broader influence that had characterized her life since the Constitutional Convention. Each opportunity for expanded impact required careful consideration of how it would affect her primary obligations to the community that had made everything else possible. Marcus emerged from the Institute's administrative offices, his bearing still reflecting his military background, but softened by years of civilian leadership and the contentment that came from meaningful work. His role had evolved from territorial law enforcement to something resembling a combination of diplomat, strategist, and educator. The criminal justice innovations pioneered in Colorado were being studied and adapted by law enforcement agencies throughout the Western territories, creating a network of professional relationships that extended his influence far beyond any individual position. The delegation from the Montana Territory has confirmed their visit for next month, Marcus reported, settling into one of the comfortable chairs that furnished the observation deck. They're particularly interested in our community defense, training programs, and the coordination mechanisms we've developed between civilian and law enforcement authorities. Apparently, they're facing organized criminal activity similar to what we dealt with during the Iron Hand Gang period. Emma nodded thoughtfully, remembering her own desperate early days when effective defense had seemed impossible and outside help had been non-existent. The evolution of Millbrook Valley's security approach, from desperate improvisation to systematic professional training, represented one of their most significant contributions to regional development. The principles they had developed were being applied successfully in communities throughout the Western Territories, creating a network of mutually supporting settlements that could coordinate responses to large-scale threats. Samuel's arrival interrupted their conversation, his clothes bearing the honest dirt of someone who still spent time in the practical work of mining and manufacturing, despite his expanded responsibilities as regional industrial coordinator. The mining operations that had begun as desperate survival measures had grown into a diversified industrial complex that provided employment for hundreds of people, while maintaining the cooperative ownership structures that had been established during the rebuilding period. The railroad executives have approved our proposal for the Advanced Transportation Research Center, Samuel announced, his satisfaction evident in both his voice and his posture. They recognize that our approaches to worker cooperation and community integration have created higher productivity and lower labor costs than conventional industrial management. The research center will allow us to develop these innovations further while providing technical training for communities throughout the region. The conversation was joined by Rose Mackenzie, whose presence continued to provide continuity and wisdom despite her advancing age. Her role as Territorial Education Commissioner had evolved into something resembling an elder stateswoman position, with her insights sought by political leaders throughout the region. The educational innovations that had been pioneered in Millbrook Valley were now being implemented in schools from Denver to San Francisco, creating a generation of Western-educated citizens who understood both democratic principles and practical frontier skills. I've been corresponding with educators in the eastern states who are interested in adapting our integrated curriculum approach to urban conditions, Rose reported, settling carefully into her chair with the deliberate movements of someone whose body had been worn by decades of frontier life, but whose mind remained sharp and engaged. They recognize that the combination of academic learning, practical skills, and civic education we've developed here produces more capable and engaged citizens than traditional approaches. Heinrich Weber's approach from the industrial district brought news of the international recognition that Millbrook Valley's manufacturing innovations were receiving. His precision metalworking operations had evolved into a research and development center that was attracting attention from industrial organizations throughout the United States and Europe. The cooperative workplace structures and profit-sharing arrangements that had been established during the community's rebuilding had proved more effective at maintaining quality and productivity than traditional authoritarian management approaches. The delegation from the German Manufacturing Association has requested an extended visit to study our worker cooperation methods, Heinrich announced in his careful English, which had improved dramatically over the years, but still retained the precision that characterized his approach to both language and metalworking. They are particularly interested in how we maintain quality standards and innovation while giving workers significant control over production processes and workplace conditions. Emma listened to these reports with a mixture of pride and responsibility, understanding that Millbrook Valley's success had created obligations that extended far beyond their own community boundaries. The principles and practices they had developed through necessity and experimentation were being recognized as having broader applications, but that recognition also created pressure to maintain and expand their innovations while preserving the local character and democratic values that had made them successful. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a telegraph message from the territorial capital, delivered by one of the young people who had grown up in Millbrook Valley and now served as communication coordinators between the community and various external organizations. The message contained news that would have seemed impossible during the community's desperate early years. Emma had been invited to serve as an advisor to the Federal Commission on Territorial Development, a position that would give her influence over policies affecting frontier communities throughout the western United States. Dr. Chen was the first to respond to the announcement, her medical training having taught her to process complex information quickly and systematically. This represents recognition at the highest levels of government that the approaches we've developed here have national significance. Emma, your work could influence how the federal government supports community development throughout the Western Territories. The impact could be enormous. Marcus approached the invitation from his law enforcement perspective, understanding both the opportunities and the risks that such high-level government involvement could create. Federal advisory positions can provide real influence over policy development, but they also create expectations and obligations that might conflict with local priorities. We need to think carefully about how to maintain our autonomy while contributing to broader policy discussions. Samuel's business background led him to focus on the practical implications of Emma's potential federal role. Government advisory positions often require extended travel and time away from local responsibilities. We've developed good systems for maintaining community functions during temporary absences, but a federal appointment might require more permanent adjustments to how we organize leadership responsibilities. Rose's historical perspective helped frame the decision in terms of long-term patterns and precedents. Frontier leaders who accept federal positions sometimes find that their influence over local communities is actually reduced rather than enhanced. The bureaucratic requirements of federal service can be quite different from the collaborative approaches that work effectively at the community level. But federal influence can also provide resources and protection that individual communities cannot achieve on their own. Heinrich's immigrant experience added another dimension to the discussion by highlighting how federal policies affected different populations within frontier communities. Emma's approach to leadership has created opportunities for people from many backgrounds to participate fully in American democratic society. If she can influence federal policies in similar directions, the benefits could extend to immigrant communities throughout the Western Territories. The conversation continued through the morning as they were joined by other community leaders and ordinary residents who had insights to contribute. The democratic decision-making processes that had been developed over years of community building ensured that major choices affecting the community's direction were made through extensive consultation and consensus rather than individual authority, even when that authority was well established and respected. Emma found herself thinking not just about the immediate question of the federal advisory position, but about the nature of leadership and influence in a democratic society. Her journey from school teacher to community leader to regional figure had taught her that effective leadership often required refusing certain opportunities in order to maintain focus on the most important responsibilities. The federal position represented recognition and influence, but it might also represent a distraction from the local work that had made that recognition possible. The afternoon brought a visit from a delegation of women's rights advocates who had traveled from Denver and Colorado Springs to study Millbrook Valley's approaches to gender equality and female leadership. Emma's example as a successful community leader had attracted attention from activists throughout the territory who were working to expand women's political and economic opportunities. Her practical achievements provided evidence that women could exercise effective leadership in frontier conditions where traditional social constraints were less rigid than in established Eastern communities. The delegation's leader, Margaret Stevens, was a lawyer who had been instrumental in securing women's suffrage in the new Colorado Constitution. Her interest in Millbrook Valley reflected her understanding that legal rights needed to be supported. By practical demonstrations of women's capabilities in leadership and governance, Emma's success provided a model that could be studied and adapted to other communities and contexts. What you've accomplished here goes beyond individual achievement, Margaret observed as they toured the community's institutions and enterprises. You've demonstrated that women's leadership can create more inclusive and effective governance than traditional male-dominated approaches. Your collaborative decision-making methods and emphasis on community welfare over individual advancement represent distinctly different approaches to political authority. Emma's response reflected the wisdom she had gained through years of practical leadership experience. I've learned that effective leadership isn't about individual authority or personal advancement, but about creating conditions where everyone can contribute their best efforts toward shared goals. Gender differences matter less than competence, commitment, and character when it comes to building successful communities. The women's delegation spent several days in Millbrook Valley, attending community meetings, interviewing residents, and observing the various institutions and enterprises that had been developed. Their final report would be distributed to women's organizations throughout the Western Territories, providing both inspiration and practical guidance for activists working to expand women's opportunities in their own communities. The visit also prompted Emma to reflect on how her own understanding of leadership and gender had evolved through her experiences. Her early years as a school teacher had been shaped by conventional expectations about women's roles and capabilities, but the crisis that had destroyed the original Millbrook Valley had forced her to discover leadership abilities she hadn't known she possessed. The community-building work that followed had required skills and approaches that transcended traditional gender categories, focusing instead on effectiveness and results. Emma's evening conversation with Marcus explored how their personal relationship had adapted to the changing demands of their expanding responsibilities and public roles. Their partnership had been forged through shared crisis and tested through success, creating a bond that could support both individual growth and collaborative leadership. Their relationship had become a model for how personal partnerships could strengthen rather than compete with community commitments and public service. The federal advisory position represents another transition point for both of us, Marcus observed as they walked through the community's residential district where families from diverse backgrounds had created homes that reflected both individual cultures and shared American frontier values. We've learned to balance local responsibilities with regional influence, but federal involvement creates new challenges and opportunities that we'll need to navigate together. Emma's response demonstrated the collaborative approach to decision-making that had characterized their relationship from its early development. Whatever we decide about the federal position, we decide together, considering how it affects not just our individual opportunities, but our shared commitments to this community and each other. The principles that have guided our work here should also guide our personal choices about the future. The final community meeting, called to discuss the federal advisory position, drew the largest attendance in Millbrook Valley's history, with Residents gathering not just from the main settlement, but from the satellite communities that had been established in the surrounding valleys. The diversity of the crowd reflected how much the community had grown and changed, while the orderly, respectful nature of the discussion demonstrated the democratic culture that had been developed through years of collaborative governance. Emma's presentation of the federal opportunity was characteristically thorough and objective, presenting both the potential benefits and the likely costs of accepting the advisory position. Her analysis included specific examples of how federal policies could be influenced in directions that would benefit frontier communities, as well as realistic assessments of the time and energy that such influence would require. The discussion that followed revealed the sophisticated understanding of governance and leadership that had developed within the community through years of democratic participation and shared responsibility. Residents asked informed questions about federal policy-making processes, the relationship between local and national interests, and the practical implications of their leaders' expanded responsibilities. Dr. Chen's contribution emphasized the broader significance of Emma's potential federal role. The principles and practices we've developed here have proved their effectiveness at the community level, but their real potential lies in their application to larger scales of organization. Emma's federal advisory role could help spread these innovations to communities throughout the Western Territories and beyond. Marcus focused on the practical implications for community continuity and leadership development. Emma's federal service would create opportunities for other community members to take on expanded leadership responsibilities. We've been developing collaborative leadership structures for years, and this could be an opportunity to test their effectiveness under new conditions. Samuel's perspective reflected his understanding of economic and industrial development issues. Federal policies have enormous influence over territorial development patterns and resource allocation. Emma's advisory role could help ensure that federal decisions support the kind of community-based development that has made us successful, rather than imposing approaches that benefit only large-scale corporate interests. Rose's historical knowledge provided context about the relationship between local and federal authority in American democratic development. The tension between local autonomy and federal coordination has been central to American political development since the founding of the Republic. Emma's federal service could help resolve some of these tensions by demonstrating how local innovation and federal support can be mutually reinforcing rather than competitive. Heinrich's immigrant perspective highlighted the international implications of American democratic innovations. The success we have achieved here has attracted attention from democratic movements in other countries. Emma's federal role could help demonstrate that American democracy can be both locally responsive and globally influential, providing a model for democratic development that other nations could adapt to their own conditions. The community's final decision reflected the mature democratic culture that had been developed through years of collaborative governance and shared responsibility. Emma was encouraged to accept the federal advisory position, but with conditions that would preserve her local commitments and ensure that her federal service strengthened, rather than weakened, the community's democratic institutions and cooperative enterprises. Emma's acceptance speech demonstrated how much she had grown as both a leader and a public speaker since her early days as a frontier schoolteacher. Instead of focusing on personal achievement or individual recognition, she emphasized the collective nature of Millbrook Valley's success and the shared principles that had made their community a model for democratic governance and cooperative development. "What we have built here belongs to all of us," Emma declared to the packed community meeting. "The federal advisory position isn't recognition of individual leadership, but acknowledgement of what we have accomplished together. The principles we have proven here: democratic governance, cooperative economics, inclusive community building, and effective collective action. These are the foundations that our nation needs to incorporate into its approach to frontier development and territorial organization." But the months that followed Emma's acceptance of the federal advisory position were filled with intensive preparation and coordination as the community adapted its leadership structures to accommodate her expanded responsibilities while maintaining continuity of local governance and democratic participation. The transition demonstrated how much the community had learned about institutional development and collaborative leadership through years of successful self-governance. Emma's federal service proved both challenging and rewarding, providing opportunities to influence policies that affected millions of people while maintaining her connection to the local community that had shaped her understanding of democratic leadership and cooperative development. Her reports back to Millbrook Valley kept residents informed about federal policy discussions while allowing their insights and concerns to influence her advisory recommendations. The Federal Commission's final report incorporated many of the principles and practices that had been developed in Millbrook Valley, providing policy recommendations that could support community-based development throughout the Western Territories. Emma's influence was particularly strong in areas related to local governance, educational policy, and economic development, where her practical experience provided insights that purely theoretical approaches couldn't match. Emma's return to full-time community leadership was celebrated as both a homecoming and recognition of the successful completion of important national service. The community had functioned effectively during her federal service, demonstrating that the institutional structures and shared leadership capabilities that had been developed could provide continuity even when key individuals were focused on other priorities. The legacy that Emma created extended far beyond Millbrook Valley or even the American frontier, influencing democratic development patterns throughout the world and providing a demonstration that democratic governance and cooperative economics could succeed under challenging conditions. Her journey from victim to survivor to community leader to national figure had proven that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they refused to accept defeat and instead chose to build something better. The final image of Emma's story showed her standing once again in the center of Millbrook Valley, but now as a recognized leader whose influence extended throughout the nation while remaining grounded in the local community that had shaped her. Understanding of democratic leadership and cooperative development. The transformation was complete, not just in her own life, but in the lives of thousands of people who had found opportunity, security, and meaning through the principles and practices she had helped develop and demonstrate. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.